There are some lives that seem to begin with conflict. Not peace, not comfort, not certainty. Just struggle. Jacob's life began that way. Before he ever opened his eyes to the world, before he ever took his first breath, before anyone could call him by name, he was already fighting. He was fighting in the womb. His mother Rebekah carried twins, but this was no ordinary pregnancy. The children inside her struggled so violently that she cried out in pain and confusion, wondering what kind of future these boys could possibly have. And the answer she received was as mysterious as it was unsettling. 2 nations were in her womb, 2 peoples would be separated from her body, and the older would serve the younger. That prophecy would hang over Jacob's entire life like a shadow and like a promise. When the day finally came, the first child was born red and hairy, and they named him Esau. Then came the second baby, his tiny hand wrapped around his brother's heel, as if even then he was unwilling to let the firstborn go ahead uncontested. They named him Jacob, a name tied to grasping, to following at the heel, to one who reaches, one who takes hold. And that was Jacob's life in a sentence. He was always reaching, always longing, always trying to take hold of something that seemed just out of reach. But what makes Jacob unforgettable is this. He did not begin as a hero. He began as a complicated man. A man of fear, a man of desire, a man who wanted blessing so badly that he often reached for it the wrong way. And yet somehow, through all of his failures, all of his schemes, all of his tears, all of his wrestling, God kept writing a greater story through him. This is the complete story of Jacob. Part 2. The Quiet Brother and the Hungry Brother. Jacob and Esau could not have been more different. Esau grew into a rugged man of the open field. He was strong, instinctive, impulsive, a hunter who felt most alive outdoors. Their father Isaac loved him deeply, perhaps because Esau brought him wild game and reminded him of strength, energy, and the rough confidence of the land. Jacob, on the other hand, stayed closer to the tents. He was quieter, more reflective, more strategic. If Esau was a fire, Jacob was smoke. Harder to grasp, slower to read, always moving in subtler ways. Rebekah favored Jacob, and perhaps that favoritism planted seeds of division long before either brother fully understood it. One day Esau came in from the field, exhausted, desperate, and starving. Jacob was cooking stew. The smell must have filled the air like a test. Esau, driven by appetite, begged for some of it. And Jacob, sharp, calculating Jacob, saw an opportunity. "Sell me your birthright." It was a shocking request. The birthright was not just extra property. It was inheritance, legacy, family leadership, a spiritual and generational future. It was what belonged to the firstborn. But Esau, tired and reckless, treated it like nothing. "What good is a birthright to me if I'm about to die?" he said. And so, for a bowl of stew, Jacob took what was never meant to be traded so cheaply. That moment revealed both brothers. Esau was careless with what mattered. Jacob was willing to seize what mattered. One despised the blessing, the other desired it deeply. But desire alone does not make a man righteous, and wanting something precious does not justify taking it through manipulation. Still, this is where Jacob's story turns fascinating, because even in his flawed hunger, we see something true. Jacob understood that some things matter more than immediate comfort. He wanted the promise. He wanted the future. The tragedy was that he kept trying to grab with his hands what could only truly be received through trust. Years passed. Isaac grew old. His eyes dimmed until he could barely see. Sensing that his life was drawing to a close, he called for Esau and asked him to go hunt game, prepare a meal, and return so that Isaac could bless him before he died. That blessing was sacred. It was more than a father's kind words. It was a prophetic inheritance, and once spoken, it carried real weight. But Rebekah overheard, and in that moment, instead of trusting the prophecy once given to her, she chose control. She pulled Jacob into a plan built on deception. She told him to bring 2 young goats. She would prepare the meal just as Isaac liked it. Then Jacob would go before his blind father, pretending to be Esau. Jacob hesitated at first, not because the lie was wrong, but because he feared getting caught. That says everything. Rebekah covered his hands and neck with goatskins, so he would feel hairy like Esau. She dressed him in his brother's clothes. The smell, the texture, the meal, everything was crafted to fool a dying man. And when Jacob stood before Isaac, the moment was heavy with tension. "Who are you, my son?" Isaac asked. Jacob answered, "I am Esau, your firstborn." It was a lie spoken in a room full of sacred things. Isaac was suspicious. The voice sounded like Jacob, but the hands felt like Esau. The clothes smelled like Esau. And in the end, Isaac blessed the wrong son, or perhaps in a deeper mystery, the right son through terribly wrong means. Jacob received the blessing of abundance, authority, and dominion. When Esau returned and the truth came crashing into the room, the pain was unbearable. Esau wept. Not a small cry, not wounded pride. He broke down. He begged his father for another blessing. But the main blessing was gone. That is one of the most haunting parts of Jacob's story. The blessing came, but peace did not come with it. Jacob won the blessing and lost his home. Esau burned with rage and vowed to kill him once their father died. So Rebekah sent Jacob away, telling him to flee to her brother Laban in Haran until Esau's anger cooled. But sometimes the road we run to for safety becomes the road where God begins to change us. Jacob left home not as a victorious son, but as a fugitive. He had the blessing, but he had no peace, no security, no home, no guarantee that he would ever see his mother again. This was the beginning of Jacob's exile. Part 3. The Dream at Bethel. Imagine Jacob alone on the road. No family around him, no servants, no inheritance in his hands yet. No warm tent, no familiar voice. Just dust, distance, regret, and uncertainty. Night fell, and he stopped to sleep in the open country. He took a stone for a pillow, a small detail that says so much about how far he had fallen from comfort. This was the man who had stolen a rich blessing, and now he slept with his head on a rock. And there in the wilderness, Jacob dreamed. He saw a stairway, or a ladder reaching from earth to heaven. Angels were ascending and descending on it, and above it stood the Lord, repeating the ancient promise given to Abraham and Isaac. The land, the descendants, the blessing, the assurance that through this family, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Then came the words Jacob desperately needed. "I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you." That is grace. Jacob had lied. Jacob had manipulated. Jacob had run. And yet God met him in the lonely place before Jacob had done anything to deserve it. When Jacob awoke, he was shaken. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He named that place Bethel, meaning house of God. Think about it. Jacob found God not in a palace, not in a perfect moment, not after moral success, but in the middle of fear, uncertainty, and the consequences of his own actions. How many people are like that? How many discover God only after everything familiar has been stripped away? How many first recognize grace, not when life feels strong, but when they are tired, exposed, and alone under a dark sky? Jacob set up the stone as a pillar and made a vow. His faith was still immature, still bargaining, still mixed with self-interest. But something had begun. The runaway had been seen. The deceiver had been addressed by heaven. And that moment at Bethel became one of the first cracks in the old Jacob. Because once a man knows he has been encountered by God, he can never again pretend his life is ordinary. Part 4. Love, Labor, and Laban's Trick. Jacob finally arrived in Haran, where he met shepherds near a well. And there, in one of the most beautiful first meetings in Scripture, he saw Rachel, Laban's daughter, coming with her father's sheep. The moment feels almost cinematic. Jacob approached, rolled the stone away from the well, watered the flock, and then kissed Rachel and wept aloud. It was not weakness, it was relief, wonder, and emotion all at once. After miles of uncertainty, here was family, here was beauty, here was hope. Jacob loved Rachel, and Laban, seeing Jacob's value, welcomed him into the household. After a month, Laban asked what wages Jacob wanted for his work. Jacob's answer was simple and wholehearted. I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. 7 years. That is a long time to work for love. But Jacob did it gladly. Scripture says those years seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. It is one of the tenderest lines in Jacob's life. But Jacob the deceiver was about to be deceived. When the wedding day finally came, Laban prepared the feast. Night fell, the bride was veiled, and in the darkness, Laban sent not Rachel, but Leah, the older daughter, into Jacob's tent. By morning, the truth exploded into daylight. Jacob confronted Laban in outrage. What is this you have done to me? And here, perhaps for the first time, Jacob truly tasted his own medicine. He had once stood in disguise before a blind father and claimed to be someone else. Now he woke beside a woman he had not chosen because another man had manipulated the night. Laban gave his explanation. It was not the custom for the younger daughter to be married before the older. If Jacob completed Leah's bridal week, he could also marry Rachel, in exchange for 7 more years of labor. And Jacob agreed. So the man who once tried to secure blessing quickly, now spent 14 years learning that love, pain, and destiny often take longer than ambition expects. But the household Jacob built was not peaceful. Leah was unwanted, and that grief mattered. Rachel was loved, and that difference mattered too. What followed was years of rivalry, sorrow, longing, and competition. Leah bore sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, along with a daughter named Dinah. Rachel, at first barren and heartbroken, eventually had Joseph, and later Benjamin. Through Leah, Rachel, and their maidservants, Jacob became the father of the family that would grow into the tribes of Israel. But if you imagine this house as holy and harmonious, you miss the ache of the story. It was a house of comparison, a house of jealousy, a house where women longed to be seen, loved, and remembered, a house where Jacob's choices created emotional fractures that his children would one day inherit. And still, astonishingly, God kept building a future through that broken family. That is one of the hardest truths in Jacob's story. God works through flawed people, not because their flaws are good, but because his purpose is greater than their disorder. Part 5. The Making of a Stronger Man. Jacob stayed with Laban for many years. After serving for Leah and Rachel, he worked further years managing Laban's flocks. He became skilled, prosperous, and increasingly aware that Laban's attitude toward him was changing. Success can reveal the insecurity in people around you. At first, Laban had benefited from Jacob. But when Jacob's own wealth began to grow, sheep, goats, servants, camels, donkeys, jealousy rose in the household. Jacob could sense it. The atmosphere shifted. The welcome felt thinner. Familiar places became uncomfortable. Then God spoke again. Return to the land of your fathers. I will be with you. That phrase followed Jacob through life. Not everything will be easy. Not everyone will approve. But I will be with you. Jacob gathered Rachel and Leah and told them his plan. Interestingly, both women agreed that their father had treated them unfairly. Together, they made the decision to leave. So Jacob departed quietly, taking his family, servants, and possessions. Rachel secretly took her father's household idols. Laban eventually caught up with them in anger, accusing Jacob of theft and betrayal. Yet after tense confrontation, the two men made a covenant and parted ways. And Jacob moved on. For years, he had been shaped by struggle under Laban. He had learned what it felt like to be manipulated. He had learned patience. He had learned endurance. He had grown in wealth, yes, but also in depth. The old Jacob who grabbed quickly was becoming a man who could carry responsibility. But one fear still waited for him. Esau. The brother he had wronged. The brother he had not faced for years. The brother who once wanted him dead. You can run from many things in life, but eventually, the unfinished parts of your past begin walking toward you. Part 6. Fear Before Dawn. As Jacob approached home, he sent messengers ahead to Esau with respectful words and generous humility. The messengers returned with terrifying news. Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob was terrified. In that moment, all his past choices came rushing back. He divided his camp, thinking that if Esau attacked one group, the other might escape. He prepared gifts, goats, sheep, camels, cattle, donkeys, wave after wave of peace offerings to soften Esau's heart. And then, perhaps for one of the first times with full honesty, Jacob prayed. Not a polished prayer, not a manipulative prayer, a desperate one. He reminded God of the promise. He confessed his unworthiness. He admitted his fear. He begged for deliverance. There is something deeply human about that prayer. Jacob had lived by strategy for so long, but now strategy was no longer enough. He had to stand in the truth. He was afraid, and he needed mercy. That night he sent his family across the river and remained alone. And there, in one of the strangest and most powerful scenes in all of Scripture, a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Who was this figure? An angel? A divine messenger? God encountered in mysterious form? However we describe it, the meaning is unmistakable. Jacob entered into a physical, spiritual struggle unlike anything before. He wrestled through the night. Can you imagine it? Dust in the dark. Breath against breath. Hands locked in strain. A soul refusing to let go. At one point, the stranger touched Jacob's hip, wrenching it out of place. In an instant, Jacob's strength was broken, yet still he clung on. "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob answered with the line that defines his life better than almost any other. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." There it is again. Jacob still hungry for blessing, but now something had changed. He was no longer tricking a father or bargaining with circumstances. Now he clung in brokenness. He asked not through deception, but through dependence. The question came, "What is your name?" Jacob. In other words, say who you are. Speak your old self aloud. Own the name tied to grasping, scheming, heel-catching. Then came the transformation. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Israel, the one who wrestles with God. Jacob limped away from that encounter, but he walked away changed. That is how real encounters with God often work. They bless us, but they also humble us. They strengthen us, but they often leave us without the illusion of self-sufficiency. Jacob had spent his whole life trying not to be weak. Now he walked with a limp. Part 7. The brother he thought he lost. Morning came. Jacob lifted his eyes and saw Esau approaching. This was the moment he had dreaded for years. He arranged his family carefully and then did something remarkable. He went ahead of them and bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. This was not the posture of a thief claiming victory. This was humility. This was surrender. This was a man willing to face the wound he had created. And then, the unexpected happened. Esau ran to meet him. Not with a sword, not with fury, but with open arms. He embraced Jacob. He threw his arms around his neck, he kissed him, and both brothers wept. After all the fear, all the imagination of revenge, all the sleeplessness, they wept. That moment is one of the great miracles in Jacob's life, not because it erased the past, but because it proved the past did not have to own the future forever. Forgiveness does not rewrite history, but it can redeem what history tried to destroy. Jacob insisted Esau receive the gifts, saying that seeing Esau's face was like seeing the face of God, since he had received him favorably. Think about that line. The man who had wrestled with God the night before now recognized grace in the face of the brother he once betrayed. There are times when the mercy of God reaches us through the mercy of someone we feared. Jacob and Esau did not become inseparable companions afterward. Their paths remained distinct. But peace replaced vengeance, and that mattered. For the first time in a long time, Jacob was not running. Part 8. Losses, Sorrows, and the Weight of Family. Jacob's story did not become easy after that. A changed man is still a man living in a broken world. There were painful events in Canaan. Dinah, Jacob's daughter, became the center of a tragedy involving Shechem. Jacob's sons responded with violent deceit, bringing shame and danger on the household. In that moment, Jacob saw something terrible. The same habits of manipulation and recklessness that had marked earlier generations were alive in his children too. Sin rarely stays in one generation. It echoes. Later, Jacob returned to Bethel, back to the place where God had first met him in exile. And there God reaffirmed his new name, Israel. It was as though heaven was reminding him, "You are not only the man you were, you are also the man I am making." But even while promises remained, sorrow did too. Rachel, the woman Jacob had loved so deeply, died giving birth to Benjamin. Her death broke something in him. The woman for whom he had worked 14 years, the woman who had carried so much of his tenderness and longing, was gone. Jacob buried her on the road, and grief became part of the landscape of his life. And then came perhaps the greatest heartbreak of all, Joseph. Joseph was Rachel's son, dearly loved by Jacob. He made it obvious, perhaps too obvious, that Joseph held a special place in his heart. He gave him a richly ornamented robe, and favoritism again poisoned the family. The brothers hated Joseph, for the robe, for the dreams, for the love he received. One day Joseph was sent to check on them. He never came home. The brothers sold him into slavery and brought Jacob his robe drenched in blood. And Jacob concluded that a wild animal had devoured his son. No parent forgets a grief like that. Jacob tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth. He mourned many days. His children tried to comfort him, but he refused comfort. Sometimes, sorrow becomes too deep for easy words. Sometimes a heart cannot be reasoned out of mourning. Years passed, and Jacob lived under the weight of that loss, not knowing Joseph was still alive. This part of Jacob's life matters because it destroys the illusion that transformation means immunity from pain. Jacob had been renamed. Jacob had encountered God. Jacob had reconciled with Esau. And still, his later years held burial, betrayal, fear, and grief. Faith does not make a man untouchable. It gives him somewhere to stand when he is touched by sorrow. Then famine came. The land dried. Food became scarce. Survival itself became uncertain. Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, so he sent his sons there to buy food, all except Benjamin, Rachel's remaining son, whom he could not bear to risk. What Jacob did not know was that the ruler overseeing grain in Egypt was Joseph, the son he believed dead, the son his other sons had betrayed, the son God had raised from slavery and prison into power. The brothers went to Egypt and stood before Joseph, not recognizing him. Joseph recognized them immediately. The emotional complexity of those meetings is extraordinary. Pain, memory, testing, restraint, hidden tears. Joseph eventually demanded that they bring Benjamin. But Jacob resisted. He had already lost Joseph, he thought. He could not lose Benjamin too. Only when the famine grew severe did he finally let Benjamin go. Imagine the old man's heart then. He was not sending grain buyers. He was sending what remained of his hope. At last, after a series of events only God could orchestrate, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph." Those words must have shattered them. The brother they had sold was alive. Not only alive, powerful. And Joseph, instead of crushing them, extended mercy. He saw beyond their evil to the providence of God. He called for his father Jacob to come to Egypt, where there would be provision during the remaining years of famine. When the brothers returned and told Jacob, "Joseph is still alive," he could hardly believe it. The text says his heart went numb because he did not believe them. Of course he didn't. Hope can feel dangerous after long grief. But when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent, something awakened in him. The old man who had spent years buried in sorrow suddenly found himself standing at the edge of impossible joy. "My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." There are some moments in life when God gives back a song you thought you had buried forever. This was one of those moments. Part 10. Jacob and Joseph, father and son. Jacob journeyed toward Egypt with his household. On the way, God spoke again, telling him not to be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there he would make him into a great nation. Even now, at the end of his life, Jacob still needed those words, "Do not be afraid." When he finally arrived, Joseph went to meet him. Pause there. A father who thought his son was dead. A son who had not seen his father for years. A lifetime of grief, guilt, loss, survival, and providence, suddenly meeting in one embrace. Joseph threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Not a formal greeting, not royal ceremony, just weeping. And Jacob said in effect, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." It is one of the most human moments in the entire story. Jacob, the man who spent so much of life grasping for blessing, was now standing in a blessing he never could have engineered. He did not scheme his way back to Joseph. He did not manipulate his way into this reunion. This was pure grace. Jacob settled in Egypt during the famine years. There, near the end of his life, he blessed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. In another surprising reversal, Jacob crossed his hands and gave the greater blessing to the younger over the older, echoing the pattern that had marked his own life. Joseph tried to correct him, but Jacob was intentional. The old man could now see something the young schemer never could. God's ways are often deeper than human custom, and blessing does not always flow according to expectation. Then Jacob blessed his own sons, speaking words that were part prophecy, part fatherly insight, part spiritual legacy. Over Judah he spoke of leadership. Over Joseph he spoke rich favor. Each son stood before a father who had known their strengths and failures, and who, in his final moments, passed on words that would echo into generations. At last, Jacob came to the end of his days. He was no longer the young man clinging to a heel in the womb. No longer the smooth-skinned deceiver in his father's tent. No longer the fugitive sleeping on a stone. No longer the love-struck servant laboring for Rachel. No longer the terrified brother awaiting Esau. No longer even simply Jacob. He was Israel. A man who had wrestled. A man who had limped. A man who had buried beloved people and yet kept walking. A man who had seen grief and grace in the same lifetime. Before he died, he made Joseph promise to bury him, not in Egypt, but in the land of his fathers, in Canaan, in the burial place of Abraham and Isaac. Even at the end, Jacob's heart was anchored in promise. He had lived in Egypt, but he did not belong there forever. Then he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Joseph wept over him, Egypt mourned him, and eventually, as he had requested, Jacob was carried back and buried in the family tomb at Hebron. The man who once fled the land in fear returned to it in honor. That too is part of redemption. So what is Jacob's story really about? Is it about deception? Yes, in part. Is it about family conflict? Certainly. Is it about love, loss, exile, and return? Absolutely. But more deeply, Jacob's story is about what happens when God refuses to abandon a flawed human being. Jacob was not chosen because he was pure. He was not great because he was always good. He was not transformed in a single moment. He stumbled into blessing. He lied for blessing. He ran with blessing. He worked for love. He suffered under deception. He feared judgment. He wrestled in the night. And in the end, he discovered that the blessing he had sought all his life was never something he could secure by force. It was something he had to receive with a broken hip and open hands. That is why Jacob still speaks to us now. Because most people are not born heroes. Most people are complicated, wounded, fearful, half-faithful, still learning, still carrying old names. And yet Jacob's life says this: your worst chapter does not have to be your final name. You may begin as one thing, and through suffering, grace, and wrestling, become another. Jacob became Israel. The heel grabber became the God wrestler. The schemer became the patriarch. The runaway became the carrier of promise. And maybe that is why his story still matters. Because it reminds us that God does not only work through the strong, the clean, and the already certain. Sometimes he builds nations through limping men. Sometimes he writes covenant through broken families. Sometimes he meets us on nights when we are alone, afraid, and out of excuses. And if he could transform Jacob, then perhaps there is hope for every restless heart still reaching for blessing in the dark.